So I want to bring you some analysis of two very good debaters, Dave Smith versus Douglas Murray. And this specifically is on Israel and the Palestinian conflict, because believe it or not, I agree with Dave on the Ukrainian conflict and with Douglas Murray on the Israeli conflict. So I come from it with that frame. But I thought it was an interesting discussion, and I want to bring some analysis to it. In general, at the outset, Douglas Murray essentially promoted credentialism, which is something that I completely disagree with. And at the end of the debate, he completely lost me. I went in fully expecting to agree with Douglas Murray on most things, and he kind of lost the audience there. And thus, he essentially did hand the debate to Dave Smith de facto. You know, it was like he went in there and he antagonized the audience by stating that one must be an expert in certain things in order to voice an opinion, which I completely disagree with, because if you just take a look at the experts during COVID versus my predictions and many of you out there, you'll find that you got so much more correct than the experts, but we still need that expert credentialed class. They've completely lost sway with many people, but that's kind of beside of the point at this moment. So let's just watch this together and I will chime in and analyze.
And I think that people have been indoctrinated by very bad actors into this, and as a result have excused atrocities or will make excuses for them, make excuses for the people who do them. I think, in addition, it plays to some of the darkest things of the regional mind as well as the international mind. The aims of Hamas, their stated aims, include the annihilation of the Jewish people. And
this is all true. It is literally in the Hamas charter.
October the 7th, they had their best go at doing that. And the fact that in a decision between whether or not you're on the side of the people who want to dance and live in peace with their neighbors, or whether you're on the side of the people who want to rampage through a dance party bar in the early morning, macheteing at people, I find it amazing that there are so many people who don't know which side they're on. But there are a lot of them. There are a lot of reasons for that. But one of the foremost reasons is the fact that the state of Israel has been uniquely libeled, has been uniquely lied about. Its history has been uniquely lied about. It has been uniquely put under an international spotlight and then misrepresented in a way which I cannot think of many other countries in the world that have been treated that way. And there are deep reasons for it and shallow reasons for it. The deep reasons include some of the most ancient bigotries of the human heart, and the shallow reasons are people who don't know what the hell they're talking about.
Okay, I think that look, I'm not going to speak for what every person out there believes. I don't exactly agree with like the characterization that there was no outpouring of like feeling after October 7th. And certainly like everybody I know was just like, oh my God, this is like a horrific atrocity. And like an unprecedented terrorist attack from Hamas, the worst terrorist attack in Israeli history.
And honestly, for me, that is the main point that I want to continue to bring up. You had this group that has indoctrinated since 2005, since taking over the Gaza Strip at behest of Israel. They have indoctrinated them. Not only Hamas, but Palestinian citizens that weren't necessarily directly associated with the group came over the border to participate in the attacks and did so with glee. They filmed the event, the atrocities, and yet still people deny the fact that they took place or try to poo-poo it despite the Hamas footage. It's like finding Nazis and the incineration of Jews on video and kind of trying to excuse it or poo-poo it. No, this is essentially they have the same aim as the Nazis, as stated earlier, the destruction of the Israeli people, and that people can't understand that October 7th is what precipitated the destruction of Gaza and the Israeli forces hunting down Hamas in that territory.
Against Israelis. And it was horrible. I think what a lot of I'm not arguing that there are no people who are actually pro-Hamas, or there are no people who are actually like hate Jews or something like that. I do think that what happens is that a lot of people get put in that category who do not belong there. Much like we've seen this over the last year and a half, where a lot of people, you have John Podhoretz calling Thomas Massie anti-Semitic scum because he said, we're dead broke. We can't afford to fund everybody else's war here. People have been calling Tucker Carlson anti-Semitic all over the place. When these are two guys.
I absolutely agree with Dave here. It's just the leveled accusation of anti-Semite if you want to stay out of the fighting and you say we have other things to consider and that we support Israel in theory, but we don't have the resources to devote to them, does not necessarily make you anti-Semitic. I agree with Dave.
Thomas Massie and Tucker Carlson, who have never uttered the words "the Jews" in their life. Like they're just not anti-Semites at all. So there's a lot of people, I think, who are, when they're critical of the Israeli government's response to this, get lumped in as pro-Hamas. I will certainly say that's certainly not my position. I think your description of them, death cult, by the way, the same term that Daryl Cooper used to describe Hamas, I think is an accurate one. And it was horrible. But I think that I think that your characterization, first of all, of that they gave the Palestinians a state in 2005 is just wrong. I just think that is not at all an accurate way to describe the disengagement, which we could get into more if you want to. But first of all, I would just point out that if the two-state solution was achieved, I assume you're arguing it was taken away after that. You're not still arguing that the Palestinians have a state, or are you saying they have had a state since 2005?
They were given a state in the Gaza.
And when was it taken away?
Well, they kind of screwed it up for themselves on the 7th of October.
So you're saying from 2005 all the way till October 7th, there was a two-state solution. It had been achieved.
Well, it was another state, yeah.
Oh, okay, but that would be two states then.
No, it was another state. It was different from the PA.
Okay, right. But I'm saying a Palestinian state.
Yeah.
Okay. So what's interesting about that is that this is not...
That's not completely true on Douglas's part. I disagree, even though they did have control of the land and they definitely screwed it up. I mean, they were given metal and tubes for water irrigation and the distribution of water, and they fashioned them into bombs and made videos bragging about the fact. So yeah, they really did screw it up. Yeah, they did continually launch rockets into Israel. Imagine having to live with that as an Israeli citizen, knowing that at any moment you have to flee for a bunker to be protected from the rockets that your neighbors are throwing into your state. But I don't necessarily believe that the Palestinians had full autonomous control over their waters, et cetera. That was done by the Israelis. So it was a quasi-state.
Like, this is not how any of the leaders really describe it. I mean, when Netanyahu himself is not claiming that they had already achieved a two-state solution, why are you talking about this? What happened in 2005 in the disengagement was that essentially Israel went from occupying the place to surrounding the place. And they've had it under a brutal blockade since 2007. And yes, you were right that it was...
Why do you... I don't agree the blockade was brutal by any means.
You don't think the blockade of Gaza was brutal?
I mean, how brutal do you think the Egyptians are?
Pretty brutal. Yeah.
They allowed stuff in.
Okay, I mean, since some stuff has gotten in, yes, that's true.
More than some stuff.
Okay.
More than some stuff.
Okay, I'll say this, right, because there's been different levels of blockade, even before 2007, going back. I know in 1996, they had like a pretty strong blockade that year. According to the World Bank, it contracted 40% of the GDP of Gaza. So just for reference, the Great Depression was a 30% contraction. This was in 1996. For 1 year, they gave them something worse than our Great Depression. That was just 1 year. From 2007 on, there's been a blockade of that country. You don't think that's kept the country?
That is what happens when you launch rockets and try to achieve terrorist attacks within the borders of another country because you hate them so much, and it's stated in your charter that you want to disappear them from the planet.
Why do you think there's a blockade of any kind?
Why is there a blockade? Well, I mean, the argument from Israel would be...
No, why do you think?
Way to restate.
I would say, okay, I think that the disengagement, I think Smotrich was correct when he said that, I'm sorry, my mistake there. I think the which another quote that I'm sure you're familiar with, but Dov Weissklav, who was the senior advisor to Sharon, was the prime minister at the time. He essentially said the reason we're doing the disengagement, the reason we're doing this is so that we can put the peace process in formaldehyde. This is the reason we're
You're
doing
not
it.
answering my question.
Yes,
You're
no,
continuing to cite
I'm getting
very
there.
right-wing Israeli
Hold on.
politicians. But what do you
I'm getting
think
there.
is the reason?
I'm getting there. I'm saying, so I think they disengaged in order to kill the peace process. I think they put the full blockade around.
The blockade, stick to the blockade. Why do you think it's there, Dave? You see, this is what I don't like when people give a big wind up before the answer, and I don't necessarily think that that is a valid critique of why there is a blockade. You're not explaining.
The country for the reason that they've always kind of done it there, that, yeah, they don't want too much stuff getting in. They want to keep them, as they put it, on a diet, and they don't want rockets to fly into Israel.
The second
That's
one
the
is a
big one.
kind of important one, isn't it? The final
Yeah,
one you said.
it is.
If the Palestinian leadership in Gaza after 2005 had not from the get-go decided to use Gaza as a stockpiling place for rockets to fire into Israel, all of it would be different.
This is
If
true.
they had
I
just
agree.
resisted the temptation that so many of us do in our lives to stop keeping RPGs in our cellars and then Katyusha rockets in our children's bedrooms, all of it could have been different. If that desire to live in peace beside your neighbors had superseded the desire to stockpile rockets, it would all be different.
Yeah, or if
And
Israel
what
just
you
hadn't
describe
occupied
as-
them for 60 years, it would all be different too.
They
I mean, why is it?
You've had since 2005. If you want to blame the last 60 years for the way that they're belligerently behaving in the last 20, I think that that is kind of, it's not a complete straw man because there are certain aspects that would lend itself going forward. But at this point, they are responsible for their actions.
Always
they
on
weren't
them.
Well, you believe in self-determination, I'm sure.
Yes, thank you.
Yes.
I believe in individual rights. Yeah, sure.
Okay, individual rights.
Self-determination, you are a libertarian. Of course you do. Now you're hemming and hawing. Come on, Dave. I like you, man.
And that includes the right to make bad decisions.
Sure.
Yes. The Palestinians in Gaza, when they voted in Hamas, made a very bad decision.
Yeah, of course,
And
Douglas.
in the years,
but
hang on,
yes.
hang on. And in the years after that, they made bad decision after bad decision. It was a very bad decision to continually fire thousands of rockets into Israel. It was a very bad decision to use what boats came in early on and to use the smuggling networks from Egypt, not to bring in supplies that you could actually build a thriving society with, but to bring in rockets. It was a very bad idea.
I concur.
No, there was not starvation in Gaza after 2005. No, there was no deficit of goods coming in. I've been plenty of times.
There was no deficit?
No, there are
No
plenty
goods were kept out.
There are plenty. How many? Have you been to the crossing points?
No.
When were you last there at all?
I've never been.
You've never been.
Well,
You've never
am I not
been.
allowed to talk about it now? I've never been to. Have you ever been to Nazi Germany? Are you allowed to have feelings about them?
You can't time travel, but you
Well,
can.
right.
But you can travel.
Okay, but
Okay, now here is a point of contention that many people have had. The fact that Dave Smith has not been to these points, whereas Douglas has, does that make Dave Smith entitled to talk about them? Yes, and not to the same degree if you've actually been there. I actually agree with Douglas. That doesn't preclude you from talking about it. But one of the places that I've been that most people haven't, right before it blew up, I was in Syria. And when you see the looks on the people's faces when they're discussing the secret service there called the Mukhabarat, and you see the fear in their eyes just in discussing it, or when you see the Israeli metal flag on the ground in Old Town Damascus, and you realize that this is the bread and circus that the regime is giving its citizens so that they can redirect their anger towards Israel. I know that that's exactly parallel to what we're discussing here, but when you go out into the desert and you meet people that have never, for the first time, they're seeing a white person or somebody with green eyes, which is what I was told when they met me. And you see how the people live and trying to catch falcons. Look, it adds a level of complexity and nuance to an understanding of a situation And it's not just Syria. I've been to China. I've been to all sorts of different places that are just, that are different than most people have been to. And I've seen how things operate there, not for a prolonged period of time, but it does make a difference if you've been there. But that does not preclude Dave from having an opinion and discussing it. But it does mean that his opinion and thought process is not going to be as rich as if he had actually set foot in said location and actually interviewed the people and discussed things and seen for himself.
So what? So what's the point? Like,
No,
okay.
I find that
Lots of people have been there and agree with me, and lots of people have been there and agree with you.
Yeah, but
so
if
I don't
you're
know
going
what
to spend a year and a half talking about a place, you should at least do the courtesy of visiting it.
All right. I just think this is a non-argument.
You don't
but
think?
Okay. No, I think it's a non-argument.
But if you're an expert,
well, you have to go and touch the ground.
No, I think you have to see. I think it's a good idea to see stuff, particularly if you spend a career talking about something. Yes, I have a journalistic rule of trying never to talk about a country.
Again, even though I haven't been to certain locations, I still have an opinion on them. And I'm repeating what I stated earlier. It doesn't make it as rich as somebody who's been there. It just doesn't. It adds a layer of nuance, even if you're seeing everything through a high resolution view, because you cannot possibly talk to everybody, but you do get a flavor that is incorporated into how you process and view different aspects of a conflict.
Passing, unless I've at least been there.
Okay.
It's a sort of normal it's a normal thing to do. You're talking about, you're talking about crossing points. And not only have you never been to a crossing point in either Egypt or in Israel, but you've never even been to the region.
Okay. Again, I think this is a non-argument. I don't understand.
No, it's not a non-argument.
Yeah, it is.
It's not a non-argument if you're insisting that you're an expert of some kind, or not claiming you're an expert, but still talking about it, about the provisions going into Gaza or not, if you've never seen any of this going on.
So you're not allowed to speak about things that you've read about. You can only speak about things that you've seen with your own eyes.
You can talk about what you want, as you're proving. But that is a different matter from spending an awfully long amount of time talking about an issue in a region you haven't even had the courtesy to visit, whilst developing all of these views about it. I mean, now I slightly get an idea of where you're coming from. You've read about this blockade, and so you imagine that that's what it is. I imagine you've read all the people who say that Gaza was a concentration camp, and you probably think that too. Am I right?
I mean, again, literally a concentration camp. It shares a lot of similarities, I would think.
Wow. Well, as I say, you can't time travel back to the Nazi era. But
I've been to Israel. I've heard people discuss the situation in Gaza. I was there in 2010. And by the way, they almost didn't let me into Israel because I had a Syrian stamp on my passport, and that was a big no-no. The only reason I got in is because an Israeli vouched for me when we were crossing in from Jordan together. That was the only reason that I was allowed in to the country. But I've heard them discuss the Gaza situation. It absolutely is not a concentration camp. There is absolutely no way that's the case. You want a concentration camp, you go see what it was like in Auschwitz, which is open, and they can describe to you what the people lived through. Not even remotely the same.
You could go to the Middle East and actually visit it.
Okay,
it's
the
not
World Bank said in 1996 for the 1 year of the blockade.
Libertarians are quoting the World Bank. I love it.
It doesn't mean anything. This is a non-argument. Yes, I'm saying the World Bank did their own analysis of this, and they said that it was a 40%
of your own analysis.
Hold on, you got to stop interrupting and let him finish the sentence.
The World Bank said that 40% drop in the GDP of 1 year due to the blockade, and there's been a blockade from 2007 on. So are you saying that this hasn't had an economic effect? Is that the argument?
No,
that's a straw man.
Have an economic effect.
That is a complete straw man. Of course it's going to have an effect. The question is why it's there to begin with.
So you're saying you have to be on the ground and do an audit of the blockade in order to be able to comment on it?
I think you should at least know what it is, what the territory is, what the situation is in the region. Yes, absolutely.
And the only way to do that is to be there in person.
I think that's the best way. It's not the only way, but it's the best way, for sure. For sure. If you have never seen the countries in question, you've never spoken to the people in question, you've never interviewed anyone, you've never gone around, you've never seen the terrain, and so on, and you've used Wikipedia, I'm sorry, no, that's not the same thing.
Okay, well, I've not just used Wikipedia, but didn't you write a big piece when the war in Ukraine first came out, titled something like, "I've been to Ukraine and they can win, they can repel the Russians"? So you could go there and still get it wrong, right?
No, I was with the Ukrainian armed forces in 2022 when they were retaking territory from the Russians.
Right, the last time they had any advances,
Yeah,
right.
I said I can see how they can win, which will be advances like that, yeah.
You said if we just fund them, or if we just arm them, that they can then they can repel.
I said that the Ukrainian army was making great successes, which it was when I was with them in the fall of 22.
Okay, listen, there were lots of people who went to Iraq and said, we'll be greeted as liberators, and it'll be paid for in oil, and democracy will spread through the region. So I don't know, either take on the...
I don't like this argument. Dave has the right to speak about a place that he hasn't been, but it doesn't make him an expert. And it does add flavor if you've been there and seen things up close in person. I'm repeating myself, but they're arguing over this point, quite in a contentious manner, all considering.
Arguments or don't, but I don't think
but your argument's incorrect.
Oh, okay, fine. Well, then present a counter argument to it. But to just tell me I'm not allowed to talk about something because I'm not an expert.
I'm not saying you're not allowed to talk about it.
Okay, fine. Well, you're not an expert, so you shouldn't talk about it.
But here's where Douglas should have what he should have stated. He must counter. This is why the blockade that you think is just there to harm the Palestinians, those in Gaza, is actually necessary and what it actually does. He has to lay out those points rather than continue to smack Dave over the fact that he's never been there, even though Dave is bringing it back up because his ego's a little bit hurt. But Douglas has failed in that manner, and this is one of the reasons that he failed in this debate, rather than saying, for example, that just because Daryl Cooper talked about Winston Churchill in the manner that he did, he has to point out why Daryl Cooper is wrong rather than attack his credentials. And this is, again, what Douglas, with his experience, should be laying forward exactly as he did when he discussed October 7th being the precipitate of what's going on in Gaza right now.
Been there. Yeah, I know. But you keep playing this game where it's like the whole opening to this podcast was like the non-experts talking about this is such a problem. Now you're saying because I haven't been there, I can't talk about it. Is there a blockade there that's causing economic devastation or not? According to the World Bank, there is.
First of all, I don't think it's a game. I don't think it's a game at all.
Me neither.
I'm not playing a game. Okay,
but this is semantics.
No, but this is important.
Mm-hmm.
I've seen plenty of this up close. I've seen plenty of this with my own eyes, because I do believe that one of the things you should do if you're talking about something is to see it.
Yeah, you've established that.
Okay.
Is there a blockade?
The blockade that existed, to the extent it existed, was a blockade to try to make sure that the Israelis and the Egyptians knew what materials were going in and out of Gaza after the first rocket fires, when Hamas, in fact, before Hamas was elected. The Israelis and the Egyptians didn't do a very good job of it, were meant to be trying to make sure that the materials that went into Gaza were not materials that could be used to build up the Gaza and Hamas war machine. The reason why trucks get searched is not because the Israelis want to search through grain or flour. It's because they wanted to stop the trucks containing the arms and the munitions that the Gazan, Hamas, and Islamic Jihad fighters were going to use to fire against Israel. And I'm sorry, it just makes the most obvious strategic sense. As the great...
I'd have to just break in. When I was in Israel, I could not cross over into Jordan from Jerusalem. That bridge was closed going that way, and I had to go to the northern crossing and then go all the way down to Amman to catch a plane out of the Middle East, as Israel was my last destination on that trip. And the Israeli soldiers, stopped my car as we were speeding along and searched it, despite the fact that I'm an American, and I was furious that they would do this. But these are the level of threats that they face, that they search cars that are headed to the border randomly because they need to know what's going on, what they have. Just as another point, that they search within Israel taxis that are transporting Americans.
Great Joan Rivers once said, if as an appeal to authority,
that one I'll allow. That one I like.
She also said that Michelle Obama's a man.
Yeah, I know she did that.
No, I'm saying she got everything right. So continue. Go ahead.
But
okay, they got some sense of humor.
As Joan Rivers said, if New York was being rocketed from New Jersey, we would level New Jersey. I don't think we need to level it, by the way. But you would at least try to make sure that rockets weren't being imported in larger quantities into New Jersey.
Of course.
Okay, that's all the Israelis were doing.
So it was overall an interesting debate. Douglas completely lost me at the end of the debate, just for the record, when Dave brought up the name Paul Wolfowitz in terms of how the war machine had been planning to attack and overthrow the governments of 7 different countries, just as a reference point as to who brought it in. And Douglas immediately stated Wolfowitz. Oh, this name, you have wolf, a very vile, scary creature from the wild that has been associated in the darkest way in fairy tales around the globe, and Witz, a Jewish last name. And it was a complete straw man. It just was, you're completely deflecting from Dave's central point and not enabling him to state it. But again, overall, I was most interested in the Israel-Hamas debate because I agree more with Dave Smith than I do with Douglas Murray on the Ukraine fiasco that's going on. And I agree more on the Israeli side with Hamas. The 7th of October absolutely precipitated what's going on in Gaza right now, and Hamas is hiding amongst the civilians. And there are so many things that have gone on. It's been portrayed very unfairly in the media, and you have to put yourself in the position of the Israelis and ask what you would do. As stated at the end, if there were rockets coming in from New Jersey, New York would level New Jersey with their superior air power, etc. So it's a complicated situation, and I feel terrible for the Hamas, for the Gazan children that are the innocents that are caught in this. That I feel terrible for. But I have no sympathy for Hamas, none, zero. And I do believe that it adds a lot of flavor if you've actually been to location and you're able to speak on it more fluently with a greater degree of understanding of the situation in the hearts of the people. That's mitigated to some degree by video and all of the reporting that goes on, but everybody gives you a biased slant. So I do think that it helps to go to the location. But it was an interesting debate overall, this part. I think overall that Douglas handed the overall debate points, if you're going to grade on that scale, to Dave Smith, because he came across a little bit arrogant, and the appeal to credentialism was not something that I really liked to hear. So let me know your thoughts. Who won the debate? What did I get right? What did I get wrong? Leave it in the comment section. Peace out.